Well, you've probably heard the saying, April showers bring May flowers. In this week's edition of the Climate Friday newsletter, we're going to break down that statement and analyze, is there any science behind the statement, April showers bring May flowers? We'll break down the data today and also what you can expect as we head towards May and the rest of the spring season. So first of all, how about those April showers? Even though we've had some cooler and damp weather lately, overall, April rainfall has been on the sparse side. We are still below 1 inch of rainfall, and there are some rainy days in that WTOL 11 weather forecast, so we'll gradually add to that rainfall, but nonetheless, we are way below normal in the rainfall department so far this April. Even though we've seen frequent showers, it really hasn't amounted to much, and we do have some more rainy days ahead. So onward to the statement, April showers bring May flowers. Where did it even originate from? Honestly, there isn't much of a scientific basis. It originated from a poet, an English poet named Thomas Tusser, who coined that phrase, April showers bring May flowers. Now, it all started off less to do with the science and more to do with giving folks in England hope that there would be some brighter days ahead. April is often a month of some icky weather in England, and Tusser, in his poetry, wanted to give folks a little bit of optimism and hope as they looked towards some brighter days during the month of May. This poem originally dates back to the late 1500s or the early 1600s, several hundred years ago, and the exact verbiage is a little bit different than the phrase that you have likely heard. We've got quotes from the actual poem that says, "Sweet April showers do bring May flowers." So is there any science to it? Well, it depends. Yes and no is the long answer to that. In England, the month of April often has some nasty weather that features some rain showers as well as chilly conditions, and Tusser wanted to give his readers a little bit of hope and optimism that the month of May would bring brighter conditions. Now, England is typically a cooler climate, and May flowers are a little more common over there. Now, when exactly the flowers come into bloom, it depends, and it is variable based on the climate that you're in. In England, for example, May is a pretty common time of year to start seeing those flowers. Now, if you live in a warmer climate, say even well to the south of Ohio, sometimes the flowers can come out in March or April, well before the month of May. Warmer climates see an earlier spring bloom. That is more typical due to the milder temperatures. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, temperature is more of a cue to those flowers to come on up out of the ground rather than precipitation. In other words, temperature makes more of a difference than those April showers. Now, too much rain or too many showers can actually be harmful. And when you get too much moisture that's saturating the soil, that can predispose those plants and those flowers to certain diseases and infections. So you want some April showers, but too much of a good thing, always a bad thing. Here's a look at our month of April and how much rainfall we normally have during the month. Now, as I mentioned, we're still below 1 inch for this month so far, and a typical April features almost 3.5 inches of rainfall. That makes it one of our more rainy months of the year. May takes the cake as the wettest month, 3.82, and not surprisingly, April and June are also on the rainy side, each of which at 3.45 inches of rainfall. So there is some validity that April is a showery and wet month on average. This year, though, hasn't quite delivered as we've been below normal in the rainfall department. Now, April rainfall, as you know, in Toledo, Northwest Ohio, Southeastern Michigan, it can be variable depending from year to year. There's some years we get 5 or more inches of rain in April. Other years, like this one, less than 1 inch of rainfall. A typical April is the second wettest month of the year, so there is some truth to the science that there are a lot of April showers, and April showers are commonplace. April, May, and June, those 3 months right around late spring and early summer, not surprisingly, those are our wettest months of the year. Now, one of the impacts of climate change that we've seen on at least the May flower bloom is that it's happening earlier and earlier and earlier, and temperature is actually the biggest predictor of the spring bloom. There have been some studies that have shown that the warmer you get, the earlier the spring bloom occurs. You can see I've got on the y-axis here April 19th. That would be a very early spring bloom and pretty soon to see the spring flowers. And May 19th, that would be a much later spring bloom. When it's colder out in the springtime, the bloom happens later in the season. When it's warmer out in the springtime, that is when you start to deal with some of those early season blooms. So again, temperature is the biggest factor that impacts when the flowers are going to start to come out. Climate change is playing a role because on average, flowering is happening earlier. Honestly, the flowers don't know the difference between what the calendar date says. All they know is the temperature. And when the temperature starts to warm up, those flowers will begin to bloom and come out of the ground. And temperature is the biggest cue that, hey, spring is here and it's time to come on out. Now, interestingly enough, and this is more of an anecdote than a scientific study, but English, as you know, writer Henry David Thoreau, he actually studied some of the spring blooms. And if we look back on the mid-1800s, some of his observations, his naturalistic observations versus what we experience now, there's actually been some substantial changes. Thoreau documented that spring bloom, and he found that a lot of those plants were only blooming in the middle of May, and now a lot of those flowers come out in early April. There's been over a month to even a month and a half shift since Henry David Thoreau did those writings. And of course, that's an anecdote, not a scientific study, but when you do look at some of those breeds out in the eastern United States where Thoreau researched, there's been a substantial change in when that bloom occurs. Temperature is the biggest factor that impacts the spring bloom, and even though precipitation and April showers do have some role, temperature is going to play more of a role than does the precipitation itself. Now, a lot of those perennials, as I mentioned, they can come out in March or April. Of course, March would be pretty early for this part of the country, but if you live further to the south in those warmer climates, the perennials coming up in March, not out of the question. And a false spring is something that we've talked about, and it's one of the problems with climate change is when you get that early bloom followed by a hard freeze. That's just not good for anyone's garden, and it's not good for the fruit crops as well. Generally, the colder the temperature, the more damaging that can be for that spring bloom. When you get down to 28 degrees, that can kill around 10% of a fruit crop due to those sub-freezing temperatures. Now, a hard freeze, that is the threshold that really starts to mean trouble. A hard freeze occurs at a temperature of 25 degrees, and that'll kill approximately 90% of an entire fruit crop. And that's when you start to experience some significant hardship on local farmers when you get that hard freeze that comes after the spring bloom. Bottom line, there is some science behind the April showers bring May flowers statement. However, temperature plays a much bigger role. And one of the things that we've experienced this April is some ups and downs in those temperatures. We got that week that felt like summer, and then also got some cooler conditions for the latter half of the month. Regardless of what May has in store, the WTOL 11 weather team will keep you updated, and you can head to WTOL.com/email for next week's Climate Friday newsletter. Thank you.